Okay, so it's already 6:01 p.m. in Stockholm, Sweden, and I would like to welcome everyone to this spring term second open lecture of the Nordic Institute of Latin American Studies, NILAS, at Stockholm University, entitled Anti-Populism Bursts in Argentinian Masses, History and Politics in the Making. This open lecture by Ernesto Semán will focus on his latest book, Breve, historia del antipopulismo, los intentos por domesticar a la Argentina plebeya de 1810 a Macri. And I'm sorry, but I will just leave the English translation of such a suggestive title to its author. The book was published by Siglo XXI, Editores in Argentina. And the open lecture will discuss the historical and political characteristics of populism and anti-populism in Argentina. My name is Gianfranco Selgas, and I am a researcher at NILAS, and during this term, I will be in charge of coordinating the Institute's open lectures. I want to welcome our speakers this afternoon. First, we have Ernesto Semán. He's an associate professor at the University of Bergen in Norway, where he teaches Latin American history and the history of United States foreign policy. He has written extensively about Latin American politics, including in Página 12 and Clarín in Argentina, in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Financial Times in the United States. Besides Breve, historia del antipopulismo, he's the author of Ambassadors of the Working Class, Argentina's International Labor Activists and Cold War Democracy in the Americas. It was published in 2017 by Duke University Press. Our discussant this afternoon will be María Clara Medina. She's an assistant professor at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg. Her work focuses on Latin American studies, human rights, social theory, and global studies. María Clara is the current president of the European Council for Social Research in Latin America, CEISAL, and since 2020, she has been the representative of the University of Gothenburg on the executive board of NILAS. So before turning over to Ernesto, I would just like to make a brief comment about our institute. The Nordic Institute of Latin American Studies, NILAS, has been conducting and promoting research on Latin America and the Caribbean since its foundation in 1951. NILAS has been characterized as an academic center focused on multidisciplinary research, teaching with bachelor's and master's degree programs, and documentation in the field of Latin American studies, particularly through the services of our library and its extensive collection of specialized books on the region. Since 2020, NILAS institutionalized its Nordic character, which makes the Institute an international node for Latin Americanists and researchers interested in Latin America, both in the Nordic countries and in the rest of the world. We have our open lectures to come, and I will soon share the link to subscribe to our newsletter service in the chat. But I just want to remind you that if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A section enabled by Zoom. You will find that at the bottom of the Zoom. Ernesto will begin his presentation for about 50 minutes. And after he's finished, or less than Ernesto will decide that. And when he's finished, María Clara will take over the discussion. And of course, we'll have time to address your questions. So that being said, Ernesto, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Gianfranco. Thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you, you and Maria, for sharing the stage or the screen with me. I don't think I'm gonna talk 50 minutes. Probably will be a little bit shorter, so we have more time for a conversation with Maria and with you and whoever has some questions. And took some notes when trying to be. I would try to be brief because otherwise, you know, when you write a book, even though it's a book that is already published almost a year ago, you feel that you know the book more than anybody else. So you have a lot of things to say about anti-populism and about the history of anti-populism. So I try to just summarize some of the main things that I think might be interesting for a discussion here. I'm happy to, not because I like presenting anything in English in particular. I feel, of course, much more comfortable in Spanish, but I'm happy to have a couple of presentations in English, because actually the biography of the book itself evolved from a discussion about language and about translation and Latin American politics in the US. I had written, I think it was 2016 or 17, an article for an online magazine, Popular, called Untranslatable Caudillo, about the use in English political literature of the word caudillo in its original Spanish, as if it couldn't be translated, as if it were a deeply Latin American malaise that came along the Latin Americanization of populism, no? Right? I think that was the beginning of the Trump administration, or the first year of the Trump administration. There were anywhere you could see in newspapers and magazines and TV and academic journals references to Latin America, comparisons between Trump and Perón, Trump and Chavez, Trump as a Latin American caudillo, all that under the belief that what was happening in the US at the moment was, one, was bad, but two, also was alien to an otherwise healthy national politics. And I think it was interesting to me to see how, for an anti-populist movement that rejected Trump and rejected his racist ideas, it was interesting to see how deeply racist it was, conceiving Trumpism as an alien invasion, as a legacy from Latin America that pervaded a rational and otherwise liberal democracy. So for today, what I will try to do is sort of describe a bit of the biography of the book, that in a way is part of the past once you have already written it, as part of my past, and partly because of that, I will try to connect it with what I'm doing these days, at least at the end of this talk. Briefly, I went from studying populism to study anti-populism in Latin America, and from there to study salmon farming in Chile and ideas of nature and sustainability in Norway and in Norwegian investments in Latin America and in Chile. And of course, it looks initially as a sort of a surprising and abrupt change, but I've been thinking about that, and I think there are some connections that I try to talk briefly today in a way that I hope opens a conversation about history and present of politics in Latin America, but not only in Latin America. And of course, I mean, the book has an initial and a straightforward concern, a contribution, we would call that, which is a question about what anti-populism is. Who are now and throughout history the forces opposing populist politics, why they are opposing populism, what is their worldview, what is their view of society and of politics that they built around the notion that populism is a threat to sort of these twin sacred gods of democracy and modern society. So initially, this history of anti-populism tried to just simply revert the usual question about why people follow populism, why people follow populist politics or populist leaders. And of course, I mean, we all in history and in social sciences in general know that populism as a category of analysis is problematic. Populism is everything, so it's nothing, so we shouldn't use it, or we should use it but be careful about it. There's many different approaches in Argentina as well. Tulio Alperindongui, the father of Argentine historiography, famously never used the word populism in his work, and still he described Peronism and modern Argentine and Latin American history in a convincing and extremely influential way. Many others do use the word populism. myself included. There are different approaches to what to do with the idea that populism is too vague as a category, about which I would say two things. One that I think is that the demands about populism as a category are in general way more taxing than what we expect from other concepts. Right? I think that if we use the same standards to judge whether democracy or liberalism actually mean anything, we will be left almost with no words to talk about politics and about history in Latin America. But second, I think that regardless whether we think it is a useful category or a concept, I think that the point is that people use it. People use the word populism, and they use it a lot. And they use it increasingly a lot. Populism is a very common term and is a way to communicate concerns about politics and about the specific relation of masses with politics, of workers and the poor or the excluded with institutions and beliefs of a modern society. It might be vague, but maybe people are trying to convey something specific. So in other words, even if it is not a useful concept, populism still is a relevant and an increasingly relevant historical artifact, a piece of the political conversation that I think we cannot simply get away with just because it's not accurate enough. So instead of trying to answer what cannot be answered and keep asking about what populism is, the book is built around the question of what who are talking about populism. And when they talk about populism, they talk against populism, right? What are the arguments against it? Who developed those arguments? What's the historical baggage of these concerns about populism? These ideas took the final form of a research project or of an essay, particularly in 2017. I remember that exactly because it was one day that I was living in the United States, and I watched online a video about an incident in Buenos Aires, in the province of Buenos Aires, where workers had taken over a factory that was shutting down. So workers were inside, the police was outside. There were several days of repression. The union that took control over the factory was controlled by the left, by the Trotskyist left. And in the middle, one of these, the episode took several days. One of these days, a congressman from this left political party came down to the factory in support of the workers. And police were just literally beating the workers, the shit out of them, including some journalists and some congressmen. And in the middle of that incident that was, of course, chaotic, and in the middle of the repression, a police officer that was somehow in charge of the repression stopped everything to talk and look at the congressman and talk to him and looking at him, he told him, don't come here to stir populism. No vengan acá a hacer populismo. And I think it was amazing. It was first, it was a weird statement because that political organization and the left in general is particularly anti-populist. But second, that the officer took time in the middle of that incident to sort of conceptualize repression, to sort of give a meaning to what he was doing. And the meaning was clear. What he meant when he said, no vengan acá a hacer populismo, is don't come here to promote social unrest, right? No vengan a romper las bolas, don't break my balls. And so no matter how vague it might sound for many, or for us, the police officer knew exactly what he meant. And the activist to which he was addressing understood exactly what the warning was, right? And the audience watching TV too. So I thought that maybe the concerns about populism were part of a larger process of the construction of a political identity that can be shared by political leaders or ordinary citizens or police officers, a sort of a lenses through which people made intelligible a labor dispute like this one, or a general situation of the country, or their own income, or the situation of a public hospital, or a decision in foreign policy. They could all be understood as a negative product of populist politics under this idea in which those who actually see populism as a problem, one, they build their own worldview about how things should be. Two, they do it in a relatively stable way throughout time. And three, they associate with others who share their views in the construction of a political project. So in a nutshell, that's a political identity, right? The title of the book could have been Anti-Populism, the History of a Political Identity, which in a way was sort of a drastic, or that's what I tried, a drastic reversion of how we read history in Argentina and to some extent in Latin America, by making visible an element, anti-populism, that until now had been invisible, had been considered simply an offspring or a consequence or a reaction against the central regional contribution to of the region to the political vocabulary, right? Populism. So the book, in a way, is an effort to trace the evolution of anti-populist politics in Argentina as an identity, or sometimes as a fragment of an identity, to name it, right? To make it visible. So what is anti-populism? What are the defining features of what I think is a dominant force in Argentine history and certainly in Argentine politics today? For Argentina, and maybe more at large, I would say that the main argument of the book is that Argentina is founded upon the invention of a plebeian world of mass politics and the subsequent promise of defending us as a community from the threat that masses entail for peace and for order. With several variations of the same argument over time and depending on the political players, anti-populism repeats three basic understandings. One is that populism is always thought as a sort of a defective form of social and political inclusion of those previously excluded in the decision-making process, whether they are poor or workers. The idea of masses, of course, changed greatly throughout history, but also immigrants or women, people who follow demagogic leaders or ideas who offer them some form of immediate protection, shelter, or a real or simulated form of satisfaction instead of long-term sustainable forms of freedom, individual freedom, right? Second, that the origins of these flaws are found outside and beyond politics, right? The way and the reason why people end up following a populist leader most of the times have less to do with how the political system is organized, with the political options available at any given time, with the way political participation is built within politics, and has more to do with some social pre-political, if you wish, conditions that sort of predispose these poor people of these masses towards following the appeal of populist leaders. The defects that can be found in the upbringing and education of poor people, in the way, the sort of a morphological way in which workers act when they act collectively, or when they act, when they are cornered by an economic crisis. The way women act more based on emotions rather than rational thinking, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of different metaphors about that. But the origins are always somewhere a little bit before politics starts, and then engage into the political system. And three, that these obstacles are not only obstacles, but the fundamental obstacles for the country economic prosperity and modernization towards the future. Anti-populism is above all, I think, a chronological argument that blames populism for holding the country into the past of the 19th century and for obstructing the country from getting the fruits of modernization. And modernization might mean very different things, but that in general had to do with a society in which prosperity depends upon the strengthening of individual freedom and private property rights. And once those two things are the core organizing ideas of political system, a modern society with an expanded middle class sort of flourishes. Now, how are these ideas grounded in history, in the history of Argentina, in this case in particular? I see it mostly in the construction of a plebeian subject. A plebeian subject that embodies these threats in different moments and in different ways. And the book, in many ways, is sort of is chronologically organized around the evolution of this plebeian subject in the 200 years of national history, from 1810, as the book says, from 1810 to Macri. 1810 is what is considered the beginning of the national history to these days. Meaning the way in which elites, but not only elites, and that's an important point about which I'm going to talk a little bit later, in which elites, but not only elites, have come to construct a sort of a pastiche, a cliché of what a popular subject is, always as an indictment of what they are, and mostly about how they act politically in Argentina. So those 200 years of national history could be organized following the line of four specific conceptualizations that are the Gaucho, the Compadrito, the cabecita negra, and the choriplanero. Four different forms of describing, but always as an indictment, of describing the plebeian world in which social upbringing and politics sort of come together in different ways, with different combinations and different components. The Gaucho, which is a figure also common in other places in Latin America, and in so many ways associated with the figure of the cowboy in the United States, is this character that during the 19th century became the follower of the caudillos. These caudillos that supposedly cannot be translated into any other language that remain in Spanish anywhere, and that are responsible for having derailed the process of national state formation during the 19th century, extending for decades a national civil war, and whose power is basically based upon the support of the Gauchos. Gauchos that express life in the countryside, unregulated, free in the sort of in the negative way, in the pre-modern sense of the expression, right? With no boundaries whatsoever. Certainly with no boundaries in terms of property, whose political support and alliance depended mostly upon material retributions in the anti-populist description. Savages, right? That obviously are mostly famous in the description that Sarmiento makes of the gaucho in Facundo. That actually he calls them los hombres materiales, which is sort of a very poetic figure, the material men, to emphasize how these people have no sense of spiritual life. And it was a material retribution that explained, for the most part, how they acted politically. He's going to change a lot these ideas over the following decades after writing Facundo, mostly when the Unitarios also thinking, believing in their own version of the gaucho, they decide to fight against the caudillos by offering them material retributions to the gauchos, and not finding like any kind of support, which forced Sarmiento to think, okay, maybe there's something else other than the material retributions in this kind of affection, in this kind of lasso between caudillos and gauchos. But the answer against the disease of the gauchos and the civil war about which they are responsible was going to be urbanization, right? The cities were going to do away with the backwardness of the life in the countryside by bringing people together in an organized fashion on the one hand, and bringing the modern instruments politically, the ideas of universal rights and legislation, etc., and materially the idea of the city itself. But the urbanization had its own downside, that it will materialize mostly towards the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, when Sarmiento is already dead. And that downside is the origins of the second figure of the plebeian politics, which is the Compadritos. The Compadritos, which internationally might be more famous because they become part of the literature and culture and folklore around Carlos Gardel, and some of his songs and his movies. Compadritos are those coming from the edges of the cities, from the suburbs, that with their immigrant accent, their immigrant networks that were hard to control from this universal idea of the national state and their immigrant interests, created political apparatus and electoral machines that became dominant in the beginning of mass politics in Argentina during the first decades of the 20th century. And that was followed by the third and probably most famous or infamous cliche or characterization of creation, or rhetorical creation of a plebeian subject, which is the cabecita negra. The cabecita negra, the black head, the blackie, is by far the most famous invention of anti-populist rhetoric, right? And it was a way to designate Perón's followers. There are many things that are specific to the cabecita negra that we can talk about later. But the point that I want to highlight in this case is that the biggest change with the emergence of the cabecita negra is that it's no longer only a social disease. These are not only people that are described and presented as defective because of their social origins, but mostly because of their explicit political support of Perón. Right? For the cabecita negra and for the gaucho and the compadritos are ubiquitous in the political landscape, and it could be associated with the radical party, but also with the conservatives, and in some cases with the liberals. It's a problem of mass politics in general. The Gaucho, to different extents, is also both a problem, but also something about which liberals think they have to appeal, have to sort of correct or fix. The cabecita negra is just a Peronist follower. And in that sense specifically, it's not possible to redeem itself from this condition. Is this character who basically support Peron and join unions after 1945 and for the following decades. And we can talk about that later, but I just want to go towards the fourth and last characterization that brings anti-populism to contemporary politics in the 21st century, which is the idea of the choriplanero. The figure that describes those who support a leader or a policy by rallying in the streets in exchange of food, just a choripan, or social benefits from the government, which is a plan, right? The word choriplanero combines poetically these two incentives that supposedly move poor people to support different political leaders or a specific political agenda. So we can come back to this idea later. But it's an idea of a world of politics that is very different from the one in 1945, a world of workers that are joining a project of industrialization, are joining it in the wrong way, but it's a project of national industrialization and modernization. The choriplanero is more a characterization of a world of politics in a country of informal economy, of poverty, of unemployment, and with a lack of vision of the future, in which masses can only act in an almost volitive fashion, right? And of course, they are not all the same. History matters. There's no teleology, and these categories or these ideas or these cliches were in a way different answers to different problems at different times. And that is something important that I hope is clear in the book. But I think that they all convey, at the same time, I think they have many things in common, and they all convey one important point that I wanted to bring into the conversation today, which is the idea of transition. These are people lost. Caudillo is a word lost in translation. Populist followers are people lost in transition, are people unable to find their place in a new order. And because of that, are people who are sort of attached, sickly attached to a past that they idealize. Transition in so many different ways throughout these 200 years of history. Transition from the countryside to the city, transition from tradition to modernity, from agricultural production to industrial production, etc., etc. To bring this idea, which is particularly prescriptive, is that I think that idea of transition in particular is what became a blueprint for the worldwide extension of the use of populism as an indictment of contemporary politics, right? Which is something that it became clear to me when reading the papers and the public conversation during the rise of Trump in the United States, but also in the case of Brexit and also the rise of the xenophobic right wing in different parts of Europe, on a different variety of movements that are somehow labeled as populist. And in which the explanation of why people support them had to do a lot with this idea of people lost in the transition from a place that they felt secure to a place that they feel uncertain, right? In this case, will be the transition from the industrial to the digital, the transition from the national to the global, from the homogeneous to the heterogeneous world. In the case of Argentina, the idea of plebeian subjects in transition that were a threat to modernization was not only, as I was saying before, a right-wing belief or something that was only created by elites. For years, it was an idea that was shared by a wide range of movements, liberals, progressives, socialists, communists. Most notably, the left during Peronism came to see populism as a deviation in the masses evolution towards a revolutionary party with class consciousness at the center. The first translations of Gramsci into Spanish, and actually the first translations of Gramsci outside Italy, were in fact done by Argentine intellectuals developing sort of a critical approach to this idea, rethinking the ideas of Caesarism and the ideas of class consciousness, reflecting about what kind of relation workers had established with Peronism. But anti-Peronism, which in Argentina, of course, is a synonymous of anti-populism in so many ways, was a core component of the left. And the reflection of the left about the resilience of Peronism and a critical thinking of their own anti-Peronism was a central input for the reconfiguration of the left in the 1960s. But something changed drastically, I would say, after the military dictatorship in 1976. Which was the last and bloodiest in the country's history. Something changed drastically in the uses of anti-populism. State terrorism at that time was founded and justified explicitly under the idea of eradicating the Marxist and populist threat. That is a quote of one of the documents by the military dictatorship. And the political documents produced during the dictatorship and the public statement by President Videla, the first dictator from 1976 to 1981, they all stressed that the country's order had been subverted by the excessive influence of unions, by the way Peronism had led to believe workers that they had more power than what they actually had, that populism was a virus that incited people to challenge order and to rebel against their place in the society and in the economy, and that in the new order, the dictatorship, bloody as it was, always talk about a transition towards some form of democracy. In the new order, people will participate in politics as long as they respected the relevance and weight of others, right? And as long as they do not disturb social order organized around the ideas of individual freedom and of private property. So here the dictatorship had sort of filtered the different components of anti-populism and came up with its most protean version. I think it was a right-wing vision of the country that stressed political order and social hierarchy, and that perceived populism as the main challenge to them. And these hierarchies could be social or racial or gendered, of course, but the respect to them, the acceptance of one's place in society, of the income or job or education or location of any citizen in the country was a sort of prerequisite for the total restoration of democratic politics. And that was the way in which the elimination of anti-populism was sort of justified and put at the center, even if it was in the middle of the Cold War, when the anti-communist jargon was much more prevalent in most other dictatorships in Latin America. In the case of Argentina, this anti-populist component became particularly central in the public rhetoric, but also in the way officials in the military government tried to make sense themselves of what they were doing, right? So from then on, and we can talk about that later, I think anti-populism became something more specific, if you want, restricted, and more increasingly an exclusive component of right-wing politics, an almost exclusively component of right-wing politics in different forms. An evolution that ended with the democratic victory in 2015 of Mauricio Macri, which was the first electoral victory in the country's history of a movement that was explicitly organized around the idea of putting an end of populism in Argentina. All these ideas about how populism was an obstacle that tied the country to the past and did not allow people to embrace the future, and that was flying around politics for so much time, became the core component of the political identity of this first victory of a right-wing, this first electoral victory of a right-wing movement in Argentina in 2015. So I've been talking like 40 minutes. I leave the book there. We can talk about later about other parts, but I just want to spend the final few minutes explaining what took me from anti-populism to salmon farming, or at least trying to explain it to you and to myself. I would say, as it is clear now, almost always the reactions about populism have been a reaction against populism, right? Sort of a violent and condescending recipe for fixing what is perceived as a deviation from how the masses should have behaved politically, and the extent to which these masses are described as the obstacle against social modernization and against economic prosperity. The way they are described, right? Anti-populism is first and foremost a narrative, a specific take on history and on the causes of events, a description that is abundant in sort of a rhetorical devices as choriplaneros or cabecitas negras, and metaphors that sort of energizes these reactions. And what emerged in the history of these reactions against populism is a variety of racial and ethnic and class and species and gender underlines and undertones in the portrayal of masses as unreasonable political players. Those who act under the irrational influence of collective thinking or of hormonal impulses are systematically portrayed as racially inferior. Their behavior is sexualized and stigmatized as that of people mentally constrained by poverty or morally corrupt by immediate needs, or people who have lost their rational thinking by joining a collective entity, and a union or otherwise, or mentally unprepared as children, or driven by hormones like historical women, or by genetically lower qualities like former slaves or negros in the widest Latin American use of the term. But among those rhetorical devices, there have been always one that explained the specifically irrational and violent feature of populist masses, and that was the figure of animals. The idea that non-human animals objectively convey the notion of disaster and lack of collective purpose and threat to social order. Actually, the first and most resilient figure to describe Peronism was produced by a congressman from the opposition in 1947, when he described the followers of Perón as the zoological flood, an aluvión zoológico. So if we take all metaphors used to describe these threats and we build sort of a social ladder for political control, animals are always at the bottom, meaning at the beginning of these constructions. And animals share, I think, with women, with workers, with kids, with blacks, with immigrants. What they share is not only that they serve as a vehicle of imagining social order, but also that they can be somewhat redeemed. that given the right circumstances, these defective features can be corrected, so workers can produce labor, so women can assist by the maintenance and expansion of that labor force, so children can adjust to rational thinking and contribute to general well-being. Something in the redemptive process turned these subjects from obstacles into resources. So connecting these dots is in this case an effort to think about discourses that tie rationality to order and to progress. I think one should always be alert about any discourse built around the notion of resource and exploitation. And it was not hard to see for me the way in which current debates about food production connected with discourses about social order and engaged in practices in which some subjects are considered inferior in rational terms, and because of that can be rationalized, can be quantified, can be turned into a resource, into a biomass, right? Discourses and practices in which the subject is named only to become invisible, a thing that we cannot see individually, but as a mass, inferior, and at the same time useful as a resource. So I know this talk is not about salmon, so I'm going to leave it there, and we can talk about that later if we want. But I just wanted to briefly see how important it was for me and how anti-populist concerns about social order are connected to sort of a larger space of discourse and practices and technologies about taming, about domesticating, and in turn, those ideas have the exploitation of non-human nature for human benefit as an ultimate source of legitimacy. So I leave it there. Thank you again a lot for staying with me.
Thank you, Ernesto. So many interesting points and things to discuss. I mean, the last part caught my attention very much. But I will turn over to María Clara. I'm really eager to hear your take on Ernesto's discussion, please.
Thank you, Ernesto, for this very, very interesting presentation. So as a reader of your book, I feel that it was very inspiring, but maybe please don't take this as a bad thing, but I found your book very entertaining. So as a reading, so and this is something that we in the historical field, we are not so used to find a book that is both illustrated and scientific, relevant at the same time as entertaining. So, but for me, it's a big plus. So for that, so I thank you for that as well. And before I start with my questions, because your book and now your presentation brought up a lot of questions, but I think I will focus on 5 of my 15 questions this time. So, but before starting with that, I just out of curiosity, I want to know, because you told us in the beginning, how do you come up with the idea, the process of creating the book. So, but how was the work with the book, the archives, talking to people, and so it was because it's a big work here behind the book. And a second question about that. So it will be a translation maybe in the future, so to English, for instance, or some other languages. Is this in the planning?
Thank you. No, first of all, I don't take your compliment of the book being entertaining as a problem. On the contrary, and you know, as we were talking about before, I think aesthetics matter in a fundamental way, and my effort with the book was not so much to discover necessarily a new archive, and trying to connect the compliment with your first question, but not so much an effort to discover a new archive, and not so much an idea that if we go back, the archive, somehow we have evolved to create, to believe the idea that an archive is sort of a building, in general, gray building, where these people come and bring you a lot of papers, and you spend a bunch of hours there. And the moment in the archive is when you find this document that had not been seen before, right? When something from the past reveals itself in front of you and allows you to create, to see the past in a different way. And I thought differently about that, and I thought that the book was more an effort to create an archive. That the problem that I was trying to solve or to face was, as I said before, how to make visible something that has not been named, but has been always there. Something which is even worse. It's not something that has been invisible. And of course, there's many ways to be invisible in history, social history. There's these cliches in which we follow official documents and we have one idea of the past, and then you start talking with people or following different kind of sources, and so you have an idea of how actually those who didn't write those official documents, slaves or black people or workers or et cetera, actually built that past. I was more interested in see how the people who actually built those documents remained invisible. What were the rhetorical devices that they use to remain invisible, under this idea that in the end they didn't exist. There was just a reaction against something that they were just coming to solve. So part of creating I'm thinking now about this, but I think a part of the idea of building an archive was aesthetic. Was an idea of that the most important contribution that the book could actually contribute to the field was a different way of telling this story. So there's a lot of course, there's a lot of work, and most of the archive work is things that I had done while working on populism, right? Which makes even more sense when I finished the book. But the effort was that how you the idea that what you build as an archive, as a sort of archaeological gesture of going back to the past and organizing the same pieces that are already available, and even maybe there are some new, and there are some in the book, but those that are right there can reveal something new, something that has not been said, by telling them in a different way. Because archives are not evidence. Archives are sort of also rhetorical spaces in which we make problematic statements about other ideas of the past. So I don't know, but I hope that answered the part of the question. And in relation to translations, I have no idea. I hope it would be great. The book, I think, did well for our very modest standards, did well in Argentina. And and the reviews in general have been good, and there have been in Argentina, of course, expectedly critical reactions against the book that have been that in many ways make the arguments of the book even more interesting. So I don't know. I think that is a good platform for thinking of a translation. I do think that some things should be rewritten in an English version, mostly because of what part of what we're talking today. I think that some of the arguments, some of the problems that anti-populist politics present in Argentina are clearly universal or transnational. Let's put it that way. From the very beginning, the analysis of the rise of Peronism has been fundamental for the construction of liberal politics elsewhere, from Simon Lipset to intellectuals and political leaders and elites in France and in Germany, but mostly in the United States, explaining populism in Argentina, trying to see why that was not a banana republic, why a country that was white and modern had presented this kind of thing that at the same time was not also a Nazi threat in a strict sense, became a very productive field for the creation of ideas of American exceptionalism, for neoconservative thinking. So there's a lot of things that are there in the book that maybe in an English version probably I would try to expand a little bit more, right?
I will highly recommend the translation
That
into
would be
English,
great.
because for the field of populism studies, so it will be a big, it is a big contribution already. So, but for the discussion, the European and maybe the global North discussion about populism that has been using Peronism and Peron as an example or a counterexample, so all the time. And I remember, but some years ago when I arrived to the European Union and dealing with the European academics and so on, that they say, "Oh, you are from Argentina, you are a historian. Yes, could you please explain Peronism for me?" So, and I said, "Do you have a couple of years so we can start the conversation now, and let's see when we will end it." So, but that was and students, coming from the students and for ordinary people, also in social events, that they will very curious about, as you mentioned, this multidimensional notion of populism that is a la Perón or a la Argentina. So that's and I learned that starting talking by starting talking about Maradona, it was a good way to start to explain about the classism and social inequality in Argentina and the historical roots of that as a base for the discussion of populism in more academic terms. So, but I just wanted to mention for the audience that still didn't read your book, that this is I call it as an inspirational, very inspirational essay, and that requires though and big encyclopedic knowledge about Argentina's history and politics and even Argentinian reality if you want to press the best out of this context. But I just I thought that is you mentioned in your book a couple of paradoxes is so when talking about different issues, but I think that the greatest paradox is that you wrote a book about anti-populism that really become a great essay about the Argentinian populism. So for me, that was the biggest paradox, and I thank you for that because we need it as that kind of book. And I thought that maybe some anti-populists will buy it and start reading about this, and they are already trapped in the in your discussion of populism as a part of the anti-populism. So because your book is, as I say, that a history of anti-populism, but unveil and reveals the social and political contributions of populism. So really, so but at that point it was very. I feel both empathy and sympathy for your arguments in the presentation. And as I mentioned, as a gender researcher, so I could feel the identification that you mentioned in your presentation today, when the discarding of the female features as part of the rationality of politics, so all the time, and how the infantilization of women as social actors. So understanding the emergence of so-called here in Europe new social movements, but for us Latin Americanists, we know that they're being emerging from a big time in the past also. So we need to do these genealogies. So in order to show that what media or social academics in the global north are presenting as newity from coming from South America, and in this case from Argentina, are in fact the result of a very long historical social processes. So I cannot talk about the movement Ni Una Menos without referring to Madres of Plaza de Mayo struggle, and I cannot refer to the Madres so without talking about other previous civil society organizations so in the history. At the same time, I like to see your genealogical methodology when recreating and seeing and highlighting the connections between the historical evolution of the populism as a movement or a concept or an idea, but also of anti-populism as a narrative. So that's been very influential in the Argentinian society. So one of my big questions when reading your book was, why is this anti-populist narrative so compelling for the Argentinian middle classes? What are they buying it? So when you're looking from outside Argentina and you see that this hate towards the vulnerable part of the populations, the more vulnerable, that you could think that classes so in Argentina that are very affected by conservative and neoliberal politics, so for their survival, so how they could hate the other vulnerable part of the history of the other vulnerables in this case. So classism, and that is accompanied by the anti-populist justification of political repression and political violence. And that this is a part that you present in the final chapters in your book. Uh, Also, the denial and maybe or the vindication even of the crimes against human rights during the dictatorship. So this is a part of a script. So that you show in your book for me that's been performed, rewrote it, and at the same time reperformed and renewed. So during uh, actualized so in the during the different moments in Argentinian history. So this is not a, maybe this is a big question about so how why is this narrative still so effective? So
Yeah, and it's a good question because why, when one describes anti-populism as an increasingly recalcitrant or reactionary form of politics, closely tied to elites' concerns about social order, it feels like it's a sort of a minority thing. whereas one of the factors that make the book interesting is that actually is not the Macri in 2015 wins a democratic election on this platform. No less than that. I think the reasons why that is appealing changes. The reason changes from time to time, and you know, I think that in so many ways during the decade of the first Peronism and the two following decades until the 70s, even though it had an appeal on middle classes that felt threatened, whether because Peronism embodies some form of authoritarian politics or because their own social status was being challenged by those coming from below, might be one of the causes. But I think that from the 70s on, I ended up asking the question the other way around. I would be surprised if anti-populism doesn't become a very appealing option, because what is being discussed in Argentina in increasingly in explicit ways, but in implicit ways for decades, for the last half century, is a discussion about how we fail or why we fail, right? If the discussion in 1945 was about the different ways of succeeding and the different ways of explaining why Argentina had become a modern industrial society, particularly egalitarian in so many fundamental ways, that could be problematic in so many others. The discussion from the 70s on is how do we explain why the country is not progressing? How do we explain why we are worse off, right? And so in that in that frame, which is the economic and social framework of Argentine history of the last half century, with a lot of changes in between. But it's basically a cycle of declining economic and social performance. The calls for social order might become so more obviously appealing on the one hand, but also the historical claim of seeing the Peronist legacies of the country that was built upon populist instruments as responsible of the current failure also makes, it doesn't matter whether I share that or not, but makes some sense, right? I think there's a question here.
Yeah, we actually have one question. We still have time. If Maria Clara, if you have more question, we can take that question maybe.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
In a couple of minutes. It's up to you.
Yes, I have a couple of more questions. So
yeah.
We can take it. So, try to follow the line of argumentation here. So, but at the same time, thinking about other my other issues when reading your book, because I was thinking about I was reading a philosopher, an English philosopher, Simon Critchley. So that was in 2015, approximately, something like that, before the pandemics, way before the pandemics, that formulated a distinction between leftist and rightist populism.
Populist. Okay.
Yeah. And then it was he created a commotion, so with a very controversial affirmation that the European Union has a deficit of populism, and that was interpreted that it was supporting the neo-Nazis movements, or maybe what kind of populism. And he just answered quite briefly that this is populism as in Peronism. So starting a big even a bigger controversy about what did he meant with that. So, and I started to think about then if it is then a distinction between this distinction between left populism and right populism that started about 20 years ago in the discussion. And it does mean that there is a good populism against a
No
bad
problem.
populism, and how anti-populism could deal with that distinction in Argentina through history. So what's the question? And so just to complete the idea, so that would be that populism as an ideology, that is the notion here. It's is it being pulled to the right will be deteriorate democracy into fascism, but if it would be pulled to the left is being as a way of aspiration to a the bigger, greater, gooder democracy. So,
Exactly.
hmm?
Well, there's two things. One is we sort of conveniently design what we are gonna define as populism in order to answer that question. And partly what I was saying at the beginning, right? But historians have a sort of a good excuse, which is to build a historical object. So if you say that Latin American populism, is these mass movements that emerged in early industrial societies between the 30s and the 60s, mostly Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, in which masses, mostly industrial urban workers, extended their participation in politics and also in the economic benefits of economic modernization in somehow authoritarian ways. In the cases of Mexico with Cárdenas, Vargas in Brazil, and Perón in Argentina, then you have an idea of populism that leaves everything like sort of contained in one specific time and space and experiences, and everything else can use that as an identity, but it's a sort of a different thing. When in general, when I wrote this book and the previous book, I tried to limit myself to using populism as a historical concept, and this. But then again, the point is that no matter what, populism is being used in so many other different ways that had nothing to do with that. And I think that, taking this, I don't know who that official was when he was talking about the European Union, but there is this idea that both Maria Esperanza Casullo and Arditi have discussed about how democracy is a combination of people, pueblo, and institutions, and expresses in a way sort of an uneven and permanently tense relation between this redemptive hope on masses and the pragmatic skepticism of officials and institutions. And when that tension disappears, populism emerges when that tension disappears, when the bureaucrats can tell you the truth, and the people are left with no agency. And I found it extremely interesting in that idea, very roughly described by me in 20 seconds, when seeing the U.S. elections in which Trump won. Obviously, he didn't win, but he ended up being president. Because I think if the problem, at least in the public conversation, was the effects of globalization in the economy, why would people vote a candidate like Hillary Clinton or any other Democratic candidate of those available? I mean, excepting Bernie Sanders at that time, that presents those problems as beyond the reach, that based their political identity in telling people there's nothing you can do about that, there's nothing we will do, there's nothing we can do about that other than adjusting to this new reality, right? So as a reaction for this, when this redemptive faith in the masses becomes cornered so much that has no voice whatsoever, of course this can explode in different ways, and I think in so many ways, yeah. In the case of the U.S., Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump expressed a reaction against that. In the way I would describe that, I will limit my use of the term populism to describe the movements that as an answer to that, as a denunciation to those elites, presented not only a project but an identity that was inclusive, dynamic, and invited towards an inclusive, more egalitarian agenda. That was not the case of Trump at any point before, during, or after the campaign, and that is hardly the case in many. I will leave the case of Hungary as a different one, but it's in general not the case of right-wing movements that are usually labeled as populist in Europe. So populism is not only hearing, and the way I see it, hearing that part of the democratic equation that has been that are being left aside, but also a way of including them. And you know, the Trumpism in so many ways, in specific economic policies, but also in the very same narrative of what Trump was as a self-made man, based on the progress of individual freedom, tied to becoming a self-made man and a millionaire, white male, middle-aged, and everything else. There was no inclusive feature in that denunciation, which I don't mean by that is not legitimate in so many other fundamental ways, but I'm saying that if populism has still an interesting value, is and from anti-populist perspectives, is that it challenges social order, right? And that opens the gates for a big political reconfiguration. I don't entirely think a political reconfiguration that allows for a reversion of this inequality that was presented before. I don't see that in right-wing politics in general, and I certainly didn't see that in Trumpism. So I would say, yeah, there's right-wing and left-wing reactions about the people, el pueblo, being left outside of the equation. And I think that is an interesting element that political scientists, I mentioned Casuccio and Arditi, but there are many others, that is sort of an interesting reminder. Democracy is not defined by institutions, but by the coexistence and tense coexistence and conflictive coexistence between institutions and the people that they represent.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto, and Maria Clara as well. We'll take the last question before we close the open lecture, and it is by Hermina Hudson. She asks, well, she says, many thanks, Ernesto, for your presentation. And she asks, you, Ernesto, associated populism with Peronism. Would you say that there is some anti-populist current within Peronism? or the other way around, there is some anti-Peronist populism in Argentina?
Yeah, terrific question, and also the short answer is yes. The longer one, yeah, I do think that the legacies of Peronism, again connecting with what we were talking with Maria before, as a plebeian politics and as a challenge to the status quo, has not been for the last several decades, that Peronist legacy has not been a property of the Peronist party or represented necessarily by the Peronist candidates, but have become sort of a legacy that is available in Argentine politics. Macri has been particularly insistent in pointing out that the populist threat in Argentina was not about Peronism, but about the specific representation of Peronism in Nestor and Cristina Kirchner, and that Peronist leaders and Peronism as a party can be actually a valuable contribution for building a hierarchical social order. In fact, his running mate ended up being a Peronist senator, right? But I also think that it's absolutely true that there are some forms of anti-populism in Peronism, but currently. But I also think that in history, Perón himself was always tensed between this kind of revoltive plebeian movement that he had created and his own needs or needs to sort of control that same movement and to restore some form of hierarchies, probably related to these right-wing politics that we were talking about before. So you can actually easily read the history of Peronism as a sort of a perpetual and so many times tragic and violent attempts by Perón to sort of revert the plebeian movement that he set in motion and to sort of bring back in a box this sort of plebeian challenge to authority, and his return to Argentina in 1974 was mostly is more easily understood as part of this concern. You could call it as anti-populist, but as a concern to restore social order and to repress social unrest than as the perpetuation of populism, right?
Thank you, Ernesto. Well, I think we can stop here. Supposed to end at Monica, you want to say something? Or?
Yes, I have just
go ahead.
last question because I'm a very curious person. So just, I know that you already got this question from some journalist, but I would like to know your answer today, because with your book, when you present the populist legacies in Argentina, so by telling us the history of anti-populism, you identify these four actors that, sorry, the anti-populism identifies these four actors as a social base of the Argentinian populism through history. So, and you mentioned them during the presentation: the Gaucho, the Compadrito, the cabecita negra, the choriplanero. So, but does anti-populism have a legacy too in that matter? So, and the other question was, is if there a populist genealogy that also identified, but this time actors as a social base of Argentinian anti-populism? And I was thinking and talking with some Argentinian colleagues, and said, let's do the historical the genealogy of the actors, the anti-populist actors. So, and how the name that they were given. So, and we came up with unitarios for the 19th centuries, and because I'm from northern Argentina, so I, I we were very used to talk about the unitarios against the federales then. Unitarios, oligarchs, guerrillas, and garcas nowadays. So would you? Yes, I know that that was a question that related to that a journalist um, put on the table for you a couple of when the
Uh,
book was recently published. But
uh,
do you have another answer today?
no. I don't remember which interview it was. But no. But the question is good, and the answer should be another talk and or another book. Um, when you finish an essay, what remains there is everything you should have done and didn't do. And certainly what you're saying is exactly what to some extent a part of that kind of a genealogy is something that I see that is there, and that could be a great a contribution. Of course, there's so many interesting things in building that kind of a trajectory of rhetorical descriptions of anti-populist politics, because it would describe not only them, and it will not only contribute to this project of make them visible, but it will also talk about how popular politics conceived their enemies, right? And how populist movements built an idea of the other as a problem. The most interesting and problematic of those characterizations, interesting for me at least, is the idea of oligarchia. Because the idea of oligarchia that, of course, Perón used widely himself, also embraced this modernist claim that there was a way to be rich and good. There was to be elite instead of an oligarch, right? And as such, as a sort of a modernist claim, became a widely shared conceptualization and not always accurate of how dominant, economically dominant groups behaved in Argentina. During the years right before Perón and during Peronism, pretty much everybody used the word oligarchy. Perón, of course, all the time. But if you see the US Embassy, the cables of the US Embassy explaining why Perón came to power were blaming the Argentine oligarchs who spend their money in luxurious goods in Europe instead of investment in improving productivity. American unions talk about oligarchy. The left talk about oligarchy. It becomes sort of a significante vacío in which you could actually put everything that was prevented the country from being modern. So yeah, I think it could be. It is something that I saw briefly when I was writing this, but then it didn't. I didn't elaborate that much about that. And then the first part of the question, if I understood that correctly, about the legacies. Yeah, I think that one of the effects of this protean version of anti-populism that became prevalent after 1976, this sort of impoverished version of anti-populism, is that it left behind a wide variety of legacies of anti-populist movements, anti-populist ideas, and criticism to populism in Argentina that were particularly interesting. That you can actually see even after the dictatorship. Well, in the case of the rise of Alfonsín, a radical who became the first president after the dictatorship, and who actually saw populism both as a contribution in terms of bringing into the core of the political system the idea of that political rights were meaningless without social ones, and at the same time very critical of the sort of lack of attention to political institutions and institutional continuity. Today, some of the best and more active environmental writers and activists have developed a very interesting and critical perspective of the role of populist leaders in the progressive coalitions at the beginning of the 20th century. Maristela Vampa writes several things about that, basically saying that in these progressive coalitions, the populist movements were actually the most conservative part, and that in the name of progress worked towards a reprimarization of their national economies, and also underestimating demands by more radical groups, mostly indigenous and environmental groups. So there's a lot of legacies that come from this, from seeing what happened with Peronism was a radical, violent, and very sudden and pretty much out of control challenge to social hierarchies and a process of redistribution of economic, political, and cultural resources. Everything changed in that sense in a very durable way. Decades and decades and decades after, you still had the legacies of that, and the criticism to many of the features of the way in which this takes place, and the ways in which Peron and Peronism tried to revert their own, the legacies of their own actions were particularly valuable. So yeah, they are there. I think they're mostly lost in the expansive presence of right-wing populism, but they are there, and they're interesting. It depends on the day. The days that we are optimistic, we think that part of that is contributing to the political debate. The days we are not optimistic, we think that politics in Argentina, and to some extent in the rest of Latin America, is increasingly dominated by more recalcitrant analysis of how social demands can be incorporated into politics.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I believe there's an interesting connection. We won't have time to go through that, but I think there's a connection between the idea of capitalism as a way of organizing nature, right? And I think that, I mean, the way you connected populism with animals, that'll be fascinating. I mean, Jason Moore, right?
They did it. It wasn't me. I just realized it at some point. They call it the alluvion zoológico. The foundational feature of anti-populism was to call them animals.
Totally. Yeah.
I didn't think about that until a year ago.
But Peronists call them gorillas as well. So this is something
for
you to realize,
exactly.
Gianfranco. So
totally. Okay, so I need to stop now because we have people that are depending on terminating the connection. But I really appreciate Ernesto and Maria Clara's time. I mean, it was fascinating to hear you talk and exchange ideas about this topic. Unfortunately, we have to stop, but I just want to remember you, all the attendees, that this webinar is being recorded. So this talk will be available. You will check in the chat that I share a link so you can access it there in the open lecture section of our website. Just a really brief comment. Our next open lecture will take place on April 26th. And now that we've been talking about capitalism and the organization of nature and to capture nature and labor, we're going to talk about violence, ecocide, and global corruption in the Venezuelan Amazon. And we'll talk about that from a political ecology perspective. So stay tuned, and remember to subscribe to our newsletter service, and you can have more information about that. So I will stop here. Thank you so much, and have a good day.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, for goodbye, everyone.